Yes. I want to talk to you a little bit about accounting today. I will say this is probably a recording. I'll probably put this up on social media, but I won't be using this because it turns out I do have COVID. So if I sound a little under the weather, well, it's because I am. So anyway, let's go ahead and get through this. I want to talk through this here with you guys a little bit about why we feel like maybe blockchain is so important in accounting, and we really need to kind of learn what distributed ledger is and understand that distributed ledger technology and blockchains underneath it. But before we even get into all of that tech, it's always a good idea to just review what is accounting. Think about this. What was the first thing ever written down? First thing ever written down. If we think back to the first time anything was ever written down, it wasn't a religious text. It wasn't anything that you might think that would have been a story. It was simply accounting information, right? It was information on cuneiform tablets, right? This is some of the first writings that we have. And what did they keep track on these cuneiform tablets? Well, these tablets, it was commodity-backed currency, right? It was a mechanism to keep track of the asset and who had ownership of that asset. So this mechanism, this clay tablet, and the way that it was used in order to mark, of course, defined what you owned. And then obviously this could easily be manipulated and counterfeited, and so thereby the penalty was very high, but the ability to do the counterfeit was easily done. So there was inherent problems in that first single entry accounting system, but basically the important thing to remember is if we have a commodity, if I'm a fisherman and I have a really great day, well, those fish are only going to be good for so long. So if I'm a salt miner, in contrast, I could mine a ton of salt and then it'd be fine for a long time. So durability is important when we think about money. And so when we look at the ability for us to take a commodity-backed asset and make it durable, a lot of times these methods need to be in place. And so then we move into the next story that we have here, which is the Isle of Yap. And if you're not familiar with the Yapese people, it's an island in the Pacific Ocean that actually used these big stones that would be carved out of big rocks, and those then carved stones would then be used. These ray stones would be used as a mechanism for exchange. Now, imagine having to move this big rock from one person to the other person's hut or whatever. It wasn't portable. So another value of money is not only that that it's hardened, but it's also portable, right? And so portability is going to be important, right? And so portable. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about the fish, and now we see the ability for us to have store value doesn't necessarily mean that portability ties directly back to the asset, which doesn't have to be in our pocket, right? So having ownership of something doesn't necessarily have to have direct possession of it. And that's kind of what we found with the ray stones, right? So the store of value mechanism is just really the mechanism that was used by the tribe, because they would all stand up and say, John owns that ray stone, and so everybody would know that's John Raystone. And then if you wanted to trade it to somebody, then he could announce that to the tribe, and everybody kept everybody honest. Well, that's just not feasible in a large society. It only scales so far. So the scalability of this was a really big problem, and again, it was extremely. We didn't really think about portability at this point because it was about using the decentralized network to keep the honesty of the ledger good, right? So that's what we were using. And so some problems that we run into when we think about tangible assets is anytime you have a scarce or tangible asset, you don't want it to be counterfeited or easily duplicated. And so, turn 1 ounce of gold into 2 ounces. You can't really do that, or even anything more than that. And so, that's just not possible. So, these items can be used then in exchange for a good of service because of its ability to be relatively scarce, right? And so when we start thinking about scarce assets that could be used for money, we used lots of things. We used tulips, we've used grain, we've used skins, animal skins, all kinds of things have been used in order to represent money. But it's mostly commodity backed, right? Backed by whatever that commodity is that's associated with that good. And so paper money was just a method, kind of an honesty method. How do we keep somebody honest in order to create an exchange mechanism? Because we want to be able to exchange goods between us. And so that method of exchange, that medium of exchange, is extremely important when it comes to money as well. And so with paper money, it was possible, obviously to copy that dollar bill, but it may be difficult and even illegal to do so. And so to duplicate a dollar, you need special equipment to do that. And so it's not the case when we think of digital money or assets. With digital assets, it's just a set of code that could be then just copied and then sent to multiple individuals. And so digital scarcity, when we think about counterfeit goods, was a real problem early on in the internet because we couldn't create something digitally scarce that had a digital footprint. Why? Well, because it could just be copied. And then I would know that, that copy is the copy of that good, right? And it's as good as the original, right? And so with digital scarcity and with having a signature on each asset, and having track and traceability of those assets at a very granular level, at that digitally scarce level, we can start to have visibility into viable assets. If something's actually a good asset or it come from the source, or if it's not, right? And so you can start to do interesting things about the digital footprint of that asset. And so if anyone can easily copy or transmit an asset to another person, then it doesn't make it digitally scarce. And so that's what happened, of course, with Napster. And so, of course, when we look at that particular use case, what happened is individuals were able to take copies of MP3 files and or songs and then just share them with anyone on the internet. And so you could just go download any song that you wanted. And so it basically prevented people from buying music. And so the music industry had to reinvent itself. And so with digitally scarce goods, we can start to address some of those problems. And so, that double spend problem with cryptocurrencies is something that we've been, kind of talking about quite a bit since the inception of Bitcoin. And so this is called the dual entry ledger. Was the first rendition of this in accounting, but with dual entry ledgers is what we're all pretty much used to. But every time we have a debit, we have a subsequent credit that references that particular debit. And so that double entry ledger mechanism is just our mechanism for keeping track of everything. Well, with cryptography, what we can do is we can create a triple entry ledger, and that's what you see with Bitcoin, and that's what you see with almost all the blockchains, is that every transaction has, a credit and debit, but it also has, even it doesn't matter if you're using the accounting model or the UTXO model, you have the transaction hash, right? And so the transaction hash is a measure of all of those attributes for those inputs and putting a signature on those inputs. And so that's what triple entry accounting does for you, is it gives you that digital scarcity at that entry level at the accounting. And so in the case of cryptocurrency, that's why you have that ledger that does that. And so it fixes ultimately what we call the double spend problem, which is again back to what I've mentioned with Napster. And that's what Bitcoin did, right? Bitcoin addressed the double spend problem, and it gives us provably scarce resources so that we can do secure communication and exchange those resources across the internet, right? And it's pretty cool that we can do that and address that double spend problem. And so with this, two approaches can be used for the double spend. You could do this in a centralized approach or a decentralized approach. The centralized approach is what we see with our bank, right? If G.I. Joe wants to receive $200 in digital cash, then they have to go to their bank account and debit their account, and then the bank is responsible for reconciling that and making that finality on that transaction. And so there's a lot of intermediaries there in that transaction path that are there that are acting as the intermediary for that merchant. In a decentralized approach, in essence, what we do is the bank is replaced with the code or the math that's open. Everybody can see it. It's on the ledger and available all the users to see and verify that the transactions occurred. And when we release value from one wallet and send it to another wallet, then that's there. We see those transactions occur, right? And so that it does this through the using the Byzantine general problem. It fixes that Byzantine general problem, which again is the double spend problem. Basically, if you're not familiar with this, the concept is that you have so many generals surrounding Rome, Byzantine generals, and if, let's say 5, and if 3 attack and 2 don't, then all is lost, right? So you got to make sure that they all attack in uniform at the same time, and you got to have a mechanism for timing this in order to make this work. And well, this has been a computing problem for a long, long time, and nobody could really fix it. And that's in essence what proof of work consensus did. Is proof of work consensus fixed the Byzantine general problem because it put a gaming mechanism along with a power mechanism, along with a resource mechanism in place that created this bingo type game that created this mechanism that ensured that those that were writing the transactions were indeed acting in an honorable manner, and they didn't try to spin things twice or try to do any fraudulent transactions. They checked the math against all of the rules that were in place for those financial transactions and making them current. So anyway, and the transitions of those assets. So that's basically what that Byzantine general problem is. And so when we think about that, let's go ahead and just kind of change our focus now, and think, okay, well, so I see how accounting has moved, okay, from beginning of time, right, really, from when humans started to keep track of everything until today. And so I can see the transition. Okay, that's fine, and that's what we're hoping that you see. But why do we need money, right? So that's the next thing that we're going to talk about. So first of all, we talked about how we're keeping track of everything that we own, right, with a digital ledger or some type of accounting mechanism. And then money in and of itself is a mechanism for us to kind of have the actual asset or something in order to exchange for these things, right? And so we're not self-sufficient, right? And we cannot exist in isolation, so we have to work in conjunction with one another, right, in societies in order to leverage the strengths of one another. And so, if we go back to the beginning of time, you're a hunter-gatherer, well, you hunt animals and maybe catch some fish, but you still can't survive without having a wife and children and clothes, and all those things are going to be necessary in order for your society to survive, right? And so if you don't reproduce, then you're all is lost. So you give something and you have in order to get what you want. And, we always do this as an exchange. So the something is the exchange for anything as far as goods and services. But when we think of what thing that we can do that we call money that can do these basic things that we want out of it, they should provide these things, right? A store of value, meaning that if I place my value here, it will stay there and I can't worry about it going away, right? And a method for me to take that value and exchange it with someone else and put it into their account. So there's an account mechanism that allows us to know how much do I have in my account and how much do they have in their account. So like, for instance, with money, we know that your piece of paper has a 20 on it, so it's worth 20 more than my piece of paper that has a 1 on it. Okay, well, I got a $1 bill and you got a $20 bill. They're both just pieces of paper that are signed by some old guys and got some old guys' pictures on there, backed by the government, but that's it. There's no other commodity backing that. That is what's called a fiat-based currency, meaning that's backed by the power of the governing body that has put in place whatever mechanisms are needed for that society to exist, right? And that's most governments, that's what their job is, right? That's basically what they're supposed to do. So when we think about trade and barter or a medium of exchange, then how do I have a medium of exchange with money? So over time, we've moved from more of that hunter-gatherer mechanism to more of a mechanism where we want to have a longer storage rate, or these cycles for income have increased sometimes. And so the exchange ratio, for fish, for instance, to wheat, or how many haircuts do you get for how many fish? How do we make these exchanges, right? How do we do these mediums of exchange, right? How do we kind of have that mechanism for medium of exchange? And so that's what the whole mechanism of trade and barter was all about. And so if we have money that can just represent that mechanism of value, then you can just exchange that, and we can all kind of be in agreement that everybody's kind of paying the equal amount. And it starts to make society work better, right? So hopefully, there's a lot of societal things going on here too that are value add propositions of having a good sound money system. And so the system was not efficient. A lot of pitfalls. If we have a paper money system, there's no common measure of value. Each good or service is pegged to that service. You have a double spend, so both parties need to want what the other one has. Or this is called the double coincidence of wants, right? So if I'm a barber and I don't need any fish, then a fisherman's not going to be able to get his hair cut as quickly as maybe a farmer that is just going to have wheat or something, right? So a fisherman, could be a victim of coincidental wants with a perishable good that isn't very potable, right? So like we talked about earlier. So and then my ability to divide that good up into smaller pieces so that I can make the purchases necessary in order for me to operate inside a society. And so the indivisibility of that good is going to be really, really important. And so we also have to have, for credit type transactions, we have to have some type of standards in place so that we can defer payments. I know you're a farmer and I know you're going to have a production of wheat at the end of the season, but you have to make it through the season to get that production of wheat. So how can we defer those payments for the goods that you need until you can make those appropriate payments? So that's kind of what we can do with standards of deferred payments. And then lastly we have, of course, the problem of storage. And we've talked a lot about that with fish, right? You could have that beautiful day of fishing, but then it doesn't store for long periods of time. So food and other perishable products spoil, and there's a problem with storage of wealth for long periods of time, especially if you're storing your wealth in something that is perishable. So we have to have a way to kind of counter that. And so when we start to think of money, a lot of times we think of money just tied directly back to the commodity, and that's a lot of times what we saw with cuneiform, right? And so store of value is really one of the main mechanisms that we see with money. Money should store value. So the Romans actually used salt. As I said before, it's non-divisible, non-perishable, it's limited in quantity and widely consumed. But the humans kept and stored reserves of salts in their homes for daily transactions. And actually, when you think of your salary, that actually comes from the word salarium, which is what the Romans paid their soldiers, believe it or not. So it's kind of an interesting concept there. But we use salt in Rome, cattle in India, tobacco in Virginia, rice in California, shells in Africa. I mean, if you can think of it, they probably used it for money. But what are we seeing here is there's things that we can see. We have the ability to store something. And we a lot of times if we got to move it over a long distance, this can be a problem. So we want to make it fairly portable. And we want it to be universally accepted, right? And so, like, for instance, India had tons of salt. So salt in India didn't mean very much, right? And so, India could disrupt the value in Rome if they leveraged their salt mines, right? So that could become a problem, right? So and then things are perishable, right? And so some form of commodity or money is going to be perishable, and if it perishes, you could just lose all of the value. So that definitely is a problem. So they needed to move a lot of times away from commodity-based money, especially if it had that perishable characteristic, or if it wasn't universally acceptable. Like butter, if it doesn't have a refrigeration system, then it's just going to melt. So it doesn't. I mean, it's perishable. So butter in and of an area that's doesn't get cold enough or gets cold enough, then it has value. If it doesn't, then it doesn't have value. So when we start thinking of what type of an asset could be leveraged in order to store value into, we look to hardened assets. And many times that comes in the form of coinage. And so metal money was very prevalent and early on, and it was used with scarce resources. So you saw coinage with silver and gold and coinage as legal tender. But when we look at this, the governments that controlled those resources, they would debase the value, right? So the government was debasing the value of the coinage in order to pay for the services that the government provided. And so, as you can see here, when we look at the Roman denarius, this is the weight of that denarius, and we can see, as it progressed from 267 BC of 6.1 grams, it's just a little over half of that by 274 AD. So in that time, what we saw is, of course, not only were they debasing the weight, but then also look at the purity. Up here, this was almost completely pure. Holy cow, this probably was pure. This, 5% purity. So you got a coin, but there's not much silver in it. I mean, it's only got 5% silver in it. It's not 95% silver, and it's smaller. So again, the debasement is if a ruler still needs to pay a soldier, let's say 1,000 coins, but checks the treasury and they only got 800 coins. What's that ruler going to do back then? Yeah, they're going to make 1,000 coins. You got it. They take that 800 coins with some copper, and they got 1,000 coins to pay the soldiers, right? And that's exactly what we've seen happen here. And so paper money got introduced by China. Actually got introduced as a banknote or a promissory note to pay. And China realized that the currency was legal tender, and legal tender was anything recognized by law to settle. So what they did is they just put heavy penalties in place for counterfeiting and relied on those to keep everybody honest. But once again, the problem of centralized currencies started to show, and they just printed too much money. And so we see that with U.S. paper currencies. So in America, if we start to think about the gold standard, so in America, with the high end of trade and common shortages of gold and silver coins became apparent, on February 3rd of 1690, the Massachusetts Bay Colony issued the first paper money in the U.S. And printed money was an easy way to create money, and it was an easy way for the colonists to be able to kind of do all of their exchanges with one another, right? And so the colonies, like the Chinese, printed too much paper money, and then what they did is they debased the value. So to counter debasement, people would hoard items that would contain gold or silver. So prior to the American Revolution, British put an end to the colonized currencies with what's called the Currency Act. And then during the American Revolution, they created the Continental Dollar via the Continental Congress in order to pay for war, and that was a paper currency. And so the gold standard was introduced. So after the war, the United States dollar that was the one that we use today. It was initially based on the gold standard, and it was directly linked to that. And so what happened is in 1913, Congress created the Fed to stabilize the gold and currency values in the U.S., and the Fed still maintained the U.S. monetary policy. Bank regulations helped to maintain financial stability through the monetary supply, through the M2, and through interest rates. So that was kind of, the Fed's job is to control how much money is in circulation. and money supply. So the dollar was directly tied to gold during the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. And what happened in the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 is gold was like at $32, and FDR said, we're going to buy your gold and you're going to make money because it's not worth $35, and we're going to give you $35 for it. But we're going to tie it at $35 so that we can stabilize our dollar at the United States. So we have a very stable economy, and everybody's going to want to kind of peg to that. And so we had a lot of gold, and so people turned in their gold reserves. And that was actually illegal up until the 70s to actually own gold other than for jewelry or religious purposes. But for store of value, you couldn't really do that. And so that was the 1933 executive order from FDR. And so the dollar to gold price pretty much held at $35, right? And it held there up until August 15th of 1971. And what happened then, and we all have heard this story, but that's when Nixon put us off the gold standard, right? To put that into perspective, $1,650 an ounce is where gold is at roughly right now. So there's a lot of inflation there, you know? So, I mean, there's a lot of other variables involved here, but I think that it's important to just look at that. Just look at the value of the dollar to buy gold when we were on a gold standard, the value of the dollar to buy gold when we're off the gold standard. So definitely worth looking at that. What are we on now? Well, you've heard me use this term a bit, but fiat. Fiat is currency that's backed by the government. Whatever the government is, they back it. So the U.S. dollar is a currency that is being used by a lot of nation states, right? And it's not just the United States, right? So a lot of times we'll call it the petrodollar, but interestingly enough, the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 required that all oil purchases be done in U.S. currency. So that's one of the reasons why we kind of make a lot of money from oil purchases and oil reserves. So anyway, I don't want to get on a sidetrack with that, but basically with fiat currency, it's not backed by any physical commodity, nor is it made of any substance of value, so it does not have any intrinsic value associated with it. It's the power of whatever government is associated with it, and you have to have a level of trust with that government. And as we've seen with different governments, the level of trust varies, right? And so you could be in a bad position. And so the government maintains its value by controlling the money supply through central bank, because the parties that engage in exchange agree in the value, and then the system follows virtually all countries today. So the major drawback to fiat is the lack of some type of a monetary policy, so that we don't have massive overprinting. And so that's something that, we've seen this happen in Cyprus. We've seen it happen in Venezuela. A lot of people cite that 40% of the M2 has been created in the last 18 months. So that's something that should probably be discussed. But those are things to think about when you're looking at this. And so when we started thinking about portability of money, we saw that happen quickly with, of course, plastic, right? So just having the ability to have plastic has created a debt society in essence, right? Where we're spending credit or putting ourselves in debt. And so digital currencies, since the inception, is kind of following that model somewhat in the portability, but it's not necessarily based on a credit, right? It's based on something they already own. So the digital scarcity problem, being able to easily copy the asset, that has been addressed through different consensus mechanisms. And so in order to ensure that whoever the blockchain network is that you're using, you probably want that to be fairly decentralized, right? So that's where a lot of arguments come in with this space, is it's not as decentralized as you think it is, right? And so there's definitely a good argument there, and I would agree with that. That is an argument I could get behind, but I feel like we can address decentralization still with power and humans and communication and open discourse and stuff like that. So anyway, that's that. I don't want to get too much of a blunder on that piece, but digital currencies, kind of the whole purpose of them was to address that double spend problem, so that when you spend your digital currency, it can't be spent a second time by you, right? So it exchanges that value appropriately. There's a lot of predecessors to Bitcoin. If we could actually tell you what Bitcoin is, it's a mashup of a lot of different technologies. And it wasn't, it came up with this idea all at once. No, it was slow renditions, DigiCash. In 1989, David Chaum came up with this process of DigiCash where cyberbucks could be traded online. And this was around before the internet even really caught hold, right? And it was just, we've all heard of a 404 error, object not found, but I think a 405 or something like that. There's a payment not defined. And if we look back in the HTML standards, a lot of times we wanted to be able to do digital transactions, but we couldn't figure out how to fix that digital scarce problem that we keep talking about, that double spend problem. Well, with Chaum, what he did is he used these cyberbucks with cryptography in order to start to address this. And then it didn't really kind of work out. And so then in 96, eGold made an attempt to make this more of a digital asset, but it's commodity backed, right? So eGold was a product of Gold and Sales Reserve Inc. But here's what happened. They had tons of bad press and bad users, quite frankly, users that were using this for nefarious purposes. So they caught the eye of authorities and they were shut down. And so what we learned is the digital asset being backed by metal coins had to have those metal coins stored someplace. And so that someplace was, I believe, in Florida, and the feds came in and just shut down, took all the gold. And so, you could trade just a tenth of an ounce or whatever, or 100th, very, very granular levels of gold, right? You get 100th of a penny and that type of thing. So very small levels or fractionalized levels that you couldn't do physically. But then when they seized everything, then obviously those assets no longer had value. So this enabled the linkage of unrelated accounts under unified control and data mining and things like that. And so eGold was an early pioneer of internet payments. That was one of the great things that they kind of figured out, where David Chaum figured out, okay, well, we have these decentralized identities and ownership of this number that represents something, but then I can use that in order to send payments to another number. And that's what eGold kind of did here. And so through eGold, it was ultimately shut down, as I said before. And then came Hashcash. And this was actually a project by a gentleman that was at Microsoft named Adam Back. He was a computer scientist at Microsoft. And a lot of people cite him as possibly being a lot of people cite these guys as possibly being Satoshi Nakamoto or the founder of Bitcoin. But what Adam Back is he was creating a project called Hashcash to help eliminate the problem with spam emails, so that basically you would kind of know where the email came from as a digital postage stamp. So you just couldn't send emails anonymously. You had to kind of have a level of payment for them through this Hashcash mechanism, and you could also know where the source originated from. And so it was for employees at Microsoft, and so one of the things that Adam Back really kind of pioneered in as well is he was a big advocate of open source cryptography, meaning that the math could be used by anyone to protect their privacy. And so at the time, RSA encryption over a certain level was illegal to be shipped outside the United States. So Adam's counter to that was to print the code actually on his T-shirt, and then fly to England, because that was his home country. And so that's kind of a fun story. But then say, well, did I break trading regulations, and did I break the law by wearing this T-shirt? And so in essence, he was making the stand that math should be available for everyone to use. And so B-Money was a product by Wei Dai in 1988. And what this was is to generate money outside of the government. And so similar to what Hashcash was doing, but it produced through engaging the use of computational power. So this is kind of where this proof of work concept comes from, is where, this certain level of computational power will give you a certain level of resources, right? So the system was designed to use cryptography instead of centralized systems for payments, but for enforcement, not for payments, but more for enforcement of the contract. So it gives us the ability for users to stay anonymous, and it set the base properties of all modern cryptographic systems. And so Wei Dai, this is Wei Dai here, and so he was one of the creators of that. And actually another interesting thing about Wei is he was one of the guys that was cited in the original Bitcoin white paper, along with Adam Back, were the first two people that were contacted actually by Satoshi. BitGold was a project by Nick Szabo in 2005, and it brings digital scarcity to the precious metals market for digital space. And so he kind of stated that gold is unforgeable and overly difficult to counterfeit due to its fixed cost in obtaining it. So its vision of BitGold was to take the value of gold and make it digital. It didn't really kind of get out of the project building phase. They didn't really kind of take off, but that was Nick Szabo proposed the concept of smart contracts. So whenever we talk about cryptocurrencies, a lot of times you're going to hear this concept of a smart contract. And this was coined by Szabo, where what he wanted to do is he just wanted to create a set of code that was a set of rules that would automatically be executed based on that code. Bitcoin, of course, hit in 2008 on Halloween, and the white paper was released, and then subsequently in the following month, the Satoshi and Hal Finney had their first transaction, and the first Bitcoin blocks were mined. And so lots happened here. There's, when we start thinking about, why do we have blocks of data? What is this block of data doing with my transactions? Well, when I look at these transactions here, these are all my transactions. Well, this is my block hash. What is that? Well, remember dual entry accounting. This is what comes in. This is what goes out. These are the payments that are made from this person to this person. So credit and debit, whatever. Debit, credit. And so here is the block hash that represents the digital identity or footprint of all those inputs. That hash is actually part of the input data for the next block that's created on top of it. The important thing to remember about this is because with a decentralized network, these hashes are really tough to come up with. And once you do come up with that hash, then you announce it to the network. Why is it tough to come up with? Because it has a hardness level to it. The hardness, for instance, on this network is it has 4 leading zeros. Well, in Bitcoin, I think right now it's 18 leading zeros. That's a lot of zeros that have to be in place in order to provide the appropriate block hash for that block. And I'll talk more about that when we get into cryptography and mining, but it's just important to understand that the block hash is part of the triple entry accounting piece that validates that the state of the asset is this, whatever it is. Whether it's the balance of Bishop's account or whether it be the state of your RV, whatever. So some disadvantages of Bitcoin include that it is highly volatile. There are a lot of black market activity. It's not very regulated, and it's very much unbacked by anyone or anything, that's an enterprise kind of authority. So there is definitely issues here. But when we think about what we talked about here, what did we get from Bitcoin? Well, that was the Satoshi Nakamoto digital cash system. That was an easy one, right? And we probably remember that Hashcash was good old Nick Szabo, and B-Money was good old Wei Dai. I think, I might have these wrong. Ooh, I can't remember. Micropayments was BitGold. And I think that's right. And eGold, blind signatures. No, that was DigiCash. That was David Chum. Is that right? I think I might have these two mixed. I can't remember. Let's try. Nope. Hashcash and BitGold. Hashcash was Adam Back and BitGold was Nick Szabo. Yeah, okay. There we go. That makes sense. Anyway, that's a fun little exercise. We'll finish this off. Let's kind of do this little exercise together, and then we'll talk a little bit about the cypherpunks, and then we'll finish off our video. But thanks for spending some time with me here on your Saturday. So next thing here is what products can be used for money? What about marbles? You think that's ever been used for money? Yep. Buckskins, ever been used for money? Yep. Bottle caps? Yep. Mirrors? Yeah. Grain and barley? Yeah. Flowers and tulips? Yeah. Mobile phone minutes? Yep. Ray stones? Oh yeah. Shells? Are you kidding me? Yep. What about dirt? Can I just put dirt? Oh yeah. Wow. So what is money again? Well, again, it's a medium of exchange, unit of account, store of value. Those are the four main functions that money needs to provide, right? There's other characteristics around money that we might find valuable, like portability and hardness and potability and that type of thing, fractionalization, fungibility, durability, liquidity, divisibility. All of these things are going to be really important. But when we think of different kinds of currencies, we either have commodity-backed currencies or we have fiat-backed currencies. You can almost even think that, a security is almost like a commodity-backed currency. I mean, it's similar to that. You have the security, which represents the commodity or the interest in the company or whatever. So I know that's probably not the right way to think about that, but it definitely makes sense, because when you think of fiat, you're really kind of putting your all your eggs in the basket of the governing body, which, if you have a lot of faith in the governing body, that's great. But the lack of transparency in government record keeping a lot of times causes us to have lack of faith, and we saw that, of course, in Venezuela and Cyprus. So I love talking to Americans about this because Americans, we have a pretty awesome system. But not everybody has this. And imagine if you were in Venezuela and you were a coffee farmer and you've just been doing this your whole life and you're so passionate about coffee. Well, now your plantation or your farm, what you've worked your whole life for, has been taken away from you because of the government, right? Because of what happened with Chavez and all this other kind of stuff. So, things can happen and they can happen really quickly, especially inside of a government society that can debase your ability to protect your assets individually as a self-sovereign human. And I think that cryptography is a run in that direction to try to give humans our tools that we need in order to become more self-sovereign. And it starts with money. So it's important to distinguish money from currency. So money, again, it's just a tool like any other tool for technology, and it's going to evolve. So historically, we've seen tooling like checking accounts or credit cards have major impact on money. But currencies should have a corresponding feature like durability. It should be portable. It should have a level of liquidity, and it should be fungible and divisible, right? And so Bitcoin kind of did a lot of these things for us, right? And it did it digitally. And so before we get into cryptography and into Web3, I think it's probably important that we look at the cypherpunk movement. If you're not familiar with this movement, I encourage you to go out and read the Crypto Manifesto by a guy named Tim May. He was a scientist at IBM back in the early 90s. But a lot of these guys that we just talked about, David Chom, Nick Szabo, Wei Dai, they all were members of the cypherpunk news group where they shared information on how they were able to use cryptography in order to ensure privacy in their communications. And also, they wanted to have anonymity or pseudo-anonymity. They wanted to have privacy and self-revelation. They wanted to have censorship resistance that included the ability to hide the act of actually hiding, right? And so this is a really good video. I encourage you to watch this. It's out here on YouTube But when you watch this video, it's going to show you, Tim May is in here a bit. A lot of the founders of the cryptocurrency revolution are in here. But it's going to show you what they set out to do. They set out to use technology, cryptography, and math in order to have privacy and communication. And so, a really great story. Spend 15 minutes to watch the video. So I like to kind of close this out with a look at a Bitcoin block explorer. So I'll just go through the highlights here. The first one that I show you here is the Genesis block. If you go out to btc.com, you look at block 0 on Bitcoin. One of the things we always love to look at on this first Genesis block is, ta-da, there it is. There's that famous headline that was on the Times in England, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout of banks. So what a lot of people cite this as is they cite it as, Bitcoin was a move in order to say, hey, we need this instead of trusting the central authority to store our value because they are affecting our value with this bank bailout. Anyway, so hopefully folks can understand what that meant and kind of see that. But whether you believe that or not, that's neither here nor there. But it's important that you do know that, that was in there. And a lot of people will cite that as the reason that Bitcoin is such a counter to government fiat. Then this is another fun block. It's always fun to look at this one, block 170. This is actually the first transaction. So if we look back, it's funny to look at this. So we know that Bitcoin hit on October 31st. So it took them until the 3rd of January in order to be able to mine the first block. And then the first transaction that actually occurred on the network was on the 11th of January. And so on the 11th, what happened is the Satoshi took 50 of his controlled Bitcoin, sent them to this wallet here, but he didn't send them 50. He only sent them 10. And who was at this wallet? Well, that was a guy named Hal Finney. So this was the very first transaction that Satoshi sent to Finney. But notice this address here and that address there, they match. Well, that was the change. He got the change back. So this is called the UTXO model. We'll talk about that more when we get into the accounting models of blockchains. But it's important to understand that for every transaction, all values are accounted for. It's called unspent transaction output, UTXO. All right, and then this one is actually a little bit later. If we look here, this is going to be in 5/22, so about 5 months later, back in May 22nd, a guy that was working to mine Bitcoin, to come up with this math problem for the transactions and win the Bitcoin. He had won some. He'd won a lot of them. He had 10,000 Bitcoin. And he wanted to get some pizzas for his dev team, and he was working in Florida. His name's Laszlo, and so in the chat groups, he just posted. He said, "Hey, if anybody can get me 2 pizzas delivered here at my office to feed my dev team, then I'll send you some Bitcoin because I don't have a way to pay for these pizzas right now." So somebody sent him the 2 pizzas for Papa John's, and he sent him the 10,000 Bitcoin. There wasn't exchange or anything on there. It was just a bulletin board where they communicated, they made an agreement, and then they did what they said they were going to do. And this was the very first transaction that happened on Bitcoin. Now, I want to leave you with something as we look at this. A lot of people cite Laszlo as an idiot because he paid 10,000 Bitcoin for 2 pizzas. I would argue that that's not true at all. Laszlo was a genius. Because what he did was he took value out of something that didn't have any value. It was just, in essence, a digital trophy that said he was able to mine the block and turned it into something that could then be a commodity that had digital scarcity to it and could be digitally tracked. And so he made the realization that this Bitcoin did indeed act as a digital cash system for exchange of resources. And in this case, those resources were 2 pizzas. So if those 2 pizzas were never purchased, we may never have realized the full value of what Bitcoin could do. And so that is that little diagram there. But it's important to kind of again just understand that store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. Those are things that we want from good hard money. Now, of course, the dollar is probably one of the best money-backed platforms that we have. But Bitcoin, it kind of does a lot of the same things. And so it's important that we, try to figure out how this is going to affect us. So hopefully this has been educational for you. And in the next section, what we'll be doing is we'll be going over Web 1 to Web 3 and talking about how that transition has occurred over time. So I hope you have enjoyed this training session, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, and take care.